Evening, people. In this video, I'd like to just talk about the stupidity of responding to racism with further racism. And this is a phenomenon I've noticed a lot in cyberspace. By the way, with racism, I also include the umbrella of xenophobia, that is, hostility towards people from another nation. Um, in my videos, I've made some pretty critical comments about various governments around the world. Um, But I'm always very careful never to talk about people's nationality. I'd like to raise a few points with this. First of all, it is fair to say that within certain nationalities, and perhaps within certain ethnic groups, you will get trends. That is to say, a lot of people having a similar interest, having similar culture, there are trends, and it would be politically correct to not to acknowledge that there is that issue. For example, it's fair to say a lot of African American people like rap and R&B music. Not all of them do, but many do. You can say a lot of British people like tea. That's just a fact. What other generalizations, trends can we think of that have some accuracy? A lot of Chinese people are shy. A lot of Russians like vodka. Um, there are these sort of trends that you can see which do carry some truth. And that's fine. And speaking about that is fine. However, what I find deeply frustrating is when you have a case of racism, and that is the definition of racism is being prejudiced against someone and hating someone for no other reason than their ethnicity. Um, and I've seen this a lot, unfortunately, in my life, both in my world and online and just generally. I hate racism. I think it's a very sad thing. I think it's depressing. I've personally experienced, um, if not racism, then definitely xenophobia. Being from Northern Ireland, I've experienced hostility growing up in England. Not so much in recent years, more when I first arrived here, so I have experienced that sort of hostility. Um, I've experienced a lot of hostility online when I've came out with critical comments about certain governments, then that has translated into, oh, you British bastard, you whites have wanted to colonize the world, etc., etc., etc. Now, let me make some things perfectly clear. I am the first to admit that my government has blood on its hands, and that Britain's imperial legacy is something deeply controversial, and I'll make another video about that. But you cannot use the wrongs of the British Empire to stir up hate against British people. Because British people, there's 63 million of us, okay? Some of us are jerks, some of us are unpleasant people, and some of us are selfless, decent people who work, for example, for aid agencies, who work in very benevolent sort of roles. You can't generalize people like that. It's just plain stupid. And it just really frustrates me when the response to racism is further racism. And I've seen a lot of Pan-Africans, that is, people in Africa who are African nationalists, basically use European colonialism as an excuse for everything, for all the problems they face. And that will then translate into, criticism of government is one thing, and I accept their right to do that. But then it translates into you white bastards this, you white bastards that. And I do take that personally. I'm a white man. Now, I cannot help the pigmentation of my skin. That's the way I was born. You want me to apologize for being white? That's as absurd as expecting people to apologize for being Chinese or black African or Indian. It's just plain stupid. And frankly, if you have a mentality where you're judging someone for no other reason than their ethnicity, then I think you're a pathetic loser. And that's all there is to it. I can honestly say, in my lifetime, sorry, I've actually got a DVD on hold here, so I have to, that's an old DVD player, have to keep it running to stop it wearing out. In my lifetime, I have met people from all ethnic backgrounds, and I'm pleased to say I've got on well with people from all ethnic backgrounds. I have met also, unfortunately, white nationalists, black nationalists, and Asian supremacists. Supremacist nationalists, I really think, is the same thing. Um, and I find that very sad. I've seen people, when I've criticized the Communist Party of China, instead of responding with just valid retorts, valid sort of counter arguments, what they will come out with is, and part of the reason I felt motivated to make this video was, when I was criticizing the Chinese Communist Party, the excuses Chinese nationalists came out with, oh, opium wars, what you people done to China 150 years ago. Now, that's just pathetic. That they would use that as an excuse to bring about. I always say my government's open to criticism, but to use something that happened 150 years ago, and then use the expression white bastards, he's not talking about the British government. He's talking about white people. And that sickens me, because for one thing, many white people will be very hostile to British government policies. If you take a poll on the streets among British people, you'll find many people are hostile to our government's actions. You'll find mixed opinions. So when you use ethnicity as a way to attack people, it's just beyond stupid, and you really, really aren't giving yourself any moral high ground. And as for using ancestor suffering, I have seen this among some black nationalists. They will use the evils of the slave trade, and there's no question about it. Slavery was one of the most evil things that ever happened in humanity, and that was at the hands of white imperialism. There's no question about it. But to use that evil to then use racism against today's generation of white people is just plain stupid. And I would argue there is absolutely you cannot blame generations from the past to justify your racism today. In other words, because your great-great-great-grandparents suffered, you can't use that to wallow around in victimhood. I am so sick of it. In the same way, I'm from the island of Ireland. It may well be that along the lines, going way back in history, some of my ancestors may well have suffered in the Great Famine. And that was a result of British policies. The mortality, at least, was a result of British policies. But I'm not going to, blame English people of today. It's just a very primitive way of thinking. What I'm getting at here is dealing with racism, with further racism, is just plain stupid. And if you have a mindset whereby you're judging someone based on their ethnicity alone, then you need to get a life. You need to meet more people. And this is often a result of a bad experience. It may be that you're an Asian person or a black person who has experienced racism. And for that, you have my sincere sympathies. No one should have to experience that. But that still doesn't justify you taking it out on all white people. In the same way, if you're a white person and you've experienced hostility from black nationalists or Asian nationalists, don't take that out on all Asian people or all black people. People are much more than their ethnicity, because ultimately we all bleed red. Yes, I'm not naive. There are cultural differences, there's religious differences, and there's certain trends. Let's be honest, there are certain trends that you can notice within different ethnic groups. But there is also common humanity. Everyone feels anger, everyone feels pain, everyone feels frustration. Racism is universal. And the fact that one ethnic group may have been the main proponents of that racism at a certain point in history doesn't justify the idea that they cannot therefore claim to be victims of racism. Because anyone can be a victim of racism. If you're attacking someone solely for the pigmentation of their skin, then you're a racist by definition. If you've had a bad experience with a certain group of people, then you've every right to be angry with those people. But do not take it out on the entire nationality or the entire ethnic group. It's just a very primitive way of thinking. And you have to be bigger than that. You know, I had a bad experience in an Italian restaurant. And a lot of Italians, they lied to me, they underpaid me, and it wasn't a good experience. A week later, I went on a holiday to Rome, and guess what? The people in my bed and breakfast treated me perfectly well, and that was a good experience. So you cannot respond to people through the scope of their nationality. And yes, there are trends, and I think there's certain parts of the world that there is a bigger racism problem in other parts of the world. I do believe in the Far East, for example, there is a hostility to outsiders, but I'm not going to say for a second that every East Asian person is a racist, because that's a stupid mindset. I'm not going to generalize 1.5 billion people and say, oh, they're all racists who hate black people and hate white people, because that's simply not the case. Unfortunately, you know, racism may always exist because there will always be people with small minds who cannot think beyond the scope of nationality and ethnicity. Now, there are valid arguments to be had about certain trends. For example, in London, it's a basic fact that a lot of knife crime is at the hands of young black men, and that's just a fact. And saying that is not a racist statement. It doesn't mean that every young black person in London is a knife thug, but the simple fact is it is a problem. Just like saying honour killings are a problem within the South Asian community. And there's other issues, you know, and I'm sure there's valid trends within white communities, but you cannot use that as a way to attack people in general, and racism really sickens me and it depresses me. I can honestly say I have friends from all ethnic backgrounds and all nationalities. I hate the Communist Party of China. I hate some of the things they do. But that doesn't mean I'm going to hate Chinese people. Because I know that there are Chinese people who hate them and hate those policies just as much as I do. And I have a lot more affinity and empathy with some people from other countries and different ethnicities than I do with some of my fellow Brits. So that just, you think about your people, you need to change that mindset. I can understand, you know, if you're an oppressed minority and you're looking for statehood, there's certain groups in the world, Palestinians, Kurdish people, there is a legitimate issue about statehood and so on, and there's complex issues behind that. But outside that, there's absolutely no excuse for nationalism or racism of any kind. And in the multicultural West, we've developed to a stage now where racism still exists, but it's shunned upon, and rightly so. But in parts of the world where multiculturalism hasn't developed, then I believe racism does still exist, and it's a big problem. And the biggest part of that problem is the denials. Racism undoubtedly exists in China, but whenever the racism is raised, a lot of Chinese nationalists come out with, oh well, he just worded that badly, or in Chinese it's you misunderstood or something. No, it's outright racism, particularly towards black people. This is a very big problem, and it happens everywhere. But in societies where racism is a serious problem, denying it is not the answer. In Russia, racism is a big problem. Anti like minorities, it's a big problem. As an international community, we have to take this seriously. We're part of an interconnected world, and if you can't accept that fact, then you have issues. And I'm not talking about political correctness here. You know, you can point out trends with a certain ethnic group, and you even have to like certain trends within a certain ethnic group, but do not resort to hating everyone from that ethnic group or hating a certain nationality. And by the way, anti-white racism does exist, and that's an unquestionable fact. It exists. The fact that white imperialists were once the main proponents of racism doesn't then exclude the fact that white people can also be victims of racism, because they can. Racism is racism is racism. It's wrong. And if you're so petty-minded to to treat someone differently for no other reason than their skin tone or their nationality, then you need to educate yourself. Just get a life. Okay, that's my rant over.